Malcolm is the president of Cognizant Digital Business, which means at Cognizant, which is a massive global consulting and software and services company, he is in charge of digital strategy, artificial intelligence, oversees an incubator, and does all kinds of other stuff. But beyond that, he's also a serial entrepreneur. He's been CEO of several companies. He also wrote a very impressive book that did really well not too long ago, 2017, called What to Do When Machines Do Everything. And finally, it wasn't until just looking around, I realized and this actually explains some things that you'll probably pick up on when you hear him talk. He got his undergraduate degree in economics. So, he's a big thinker about business. And I think that's what we're going to learn here. So Malcolm, thank you for being with us. Thank you for being here. And thank you for wanting to talk about this particular topic. So what I guess I'd love you to just start talking about is, as the guy who's overseeing digital business at Cognizant, and you have some huge clients in all kinds of industries, and you're thinking what is possible even in every industry, how would you characterize what's happening right now in 2020 with digital transformation?
Thanks, David. Thanks for having me. And it's a great question. So I'll try to keep the aperture just to what's happening in business and with digital, because it's been a heck of a year. It's accelerated probably fourfold. We're moving 4 times faster, this year. And so I think as an individual or as a business, you got to think of a week is worth a month. And are you moving at that pace, and are you gaining ground? Or if you're not, you're probably ceding it. And we saw this, for example, look at the platform we're on right now with Zoom. Look what happened with Slack yesterday. So just in that market, we're seeing that separation. And I think of these times often as, by way of analogy, like the Tour de France. If you watch that race, you have those segments that are on the plains, and the peloton, comes up to the line, and there's 27 people that cross it, a second apart from one another, and you just hope they don't crash. But when you get into the mountains, that's where the separation occurs, and people can win stages by several minutes and just blow the race wide open. So this window of time is similar to being in the mountains in the Tour de France. And are you able to move really quickly, focus on certain areas in digital and past competition? And to speak more prosaically, we're seeing it manifest in a few areas. The first is data modernization, that organizations need to get their data under control. And there's a recognition that, like building a skyscraper, the foundation of any digital business is your data. So can you modernize it so you can create those moments of magic for a consumer? We're also seeing it with software product engineering. It's the capabilities that we've seen up and down Route 101 in Silicon Valley. The entire Fortune 500 now has to have that capability set. A third thing technically that's happened this year is IoT. We've been talking about it for years. I think it finally found its business model this year. And it found it through some applications like smart products, and with COVID, safe buildings. We're doing a lot of work actually in distribution centers, in factories, and I think it's going to move to consumer areas where you can really do social distancing through technology and to ensure a building is as safe as it possibly can be. And I think finally, the battleground for the next 10 years with all of this is how organizations can compete through experience, and it's digital experience. So how do you make software that's engaging and beautiful and enticing? And that really is the battleground. If you can meet that, I think that you're going to be well rewarded for the next several years. But let's just say that's a growth area for most established companies.
Right. So there's a new focus on the customer experience, which I would assume in the course of achieving that, companies are getting much more understanding of their customers by necessity. So there's sort of a bonding of the customer and the company. Just to finish out this portion of the conversation, and I do welcome the audience to ask questions or comments as we go forward here. How different are the new industries going to be as we go forward? And it's encouraging that I agree that a lot of big companies in many industries now realize they have to have the same skills and capabilities that Facebook and Google and Amazon and Microsoft and Apple have so long been taken for granted for having. But once those other industries get some of those capabilities, how different are they going to look?
I think they'll look very different and look the same. So where they're going to be the same, David, I think in 2030, it'll be the same names, maybe just ordered differently. So you look at a league table by industry and you'll recognize more than half the names, but you'll say, wow, I remember back in 2020, that firm was a laggard and now they're really hot, and vice versa. But we're now getting to the important stuff, not to be disparaging of the FANG vendors, but I think we'll look back and say that was a bit trivial. We're now getting to digitizing the pillars of a good society. And so those pillars have been around for centuries, whether that's the healthcare system, the banking system, insurance, education, government. And this is important stuff. Hopefully we're going to look back 2030 to today the same way we may look at, George Washington would have leeches on his body, and that was, how they tried to cure him of ills. And we'll just look back and say, wow, that was a lot of healthcare theater that we got involved with. Just one example, last year in the US, there were about 36 million telehealth visits. This year, we've blown past 1 billion. So I think that's a positive outcome with COVID, and it was held back for lots of reasons. And we just blew through all of those reasons. And now every participant is saying it's a better way of doing things. I think there's a wisdom in the US government this year to allow therapy for mental health to occur across state lines virtually. Again, that's a game changer that's going to serve society very well for a long period of time. So this digitization around the pillars of a good society, I think, with COVID, obviously, we're going to look back and this is a terrible chapter that we're all going through. But if there's some silver linings, I think it's to catalyze these elements that will, drive great benefit.
And here's where I do see a overlap with Bill McDonough's presentation just now. I mean, he has very visionary language, waging peace through commerce. But when you talk about businesses helping to establish the pillars of a good society by essentially being more effective at what they do, by being more digitally competent, that's really where we get to the second half of the description of this session, turning toward a stakeholder-centric company. First, maybe just quickly, do you think companies are thinking about it this way? Or are they, companies, of course, know that people like Larry Fink have said they've got to become more stakeholder-centric, et cetera, et cetera. But are the companies themselves yet making a connection between being more stakeholder-centric, being more societally responsive, and being more digitally capable?
No.
No.
I think, David, we're now at an age, both of us, that you stop listening to what people say and you start paying attention to what they do. So there's been a lot of great talk on this. And I really commend Larry. He was the one who was out in front on this, and the Business Roundtable has followed up, and others. But there's still a lot of talk about stakeholder capitalism as opposed to boards and management teams rethinking their theory of a business. And what does it stand for, and how is it managed, and what is the P&L, and making tough choices in that process. That is yet to really occur. One example that we're all living through this year is the whole BLM movement over the course of the summer. And there were lots of wonderful pronouncements and statements from different management teams. But how well are some of those going to age? It's not what you said in the summer of 2020, it's what your workforce looks like in 2022, 2023. And that's just a subset of overall stakeholder capitalism. So I think it's one of those where the head and the heart and the will all have to come together. And I think with most organizations, unfortunately, we're still early in that journey, but we've got to stick with it.
But give a few examples of how being more digitally savvy, utilizing data more effectively can allow you to be more stakeholder-centric.
Yeah. I think this is where the key is, and the optimism I have is that digital may break this open and we can solve this problem through digital. And they may seem counterintuitive because we look at a lot of the FANG vendors and people are saying, whoa, it's, some of them have behaved very badly during this chapter because they're putting shareholders over stakeholders. And we know all of the examples and all of the associated data. But in these other industries that we're talking about, most of them in an industrial context have been, if you will, input oriented. They will just deliver X and say, David, good luck with it. So a college will say, here's your diploma. You worry about your debt and your career, you go figure it out. And the same is true with maybe an automobile. You buy it, you drive it off the lot, it's yours. When you can track all of those through data, I think car ownership, it's not just a machine that will hopefully last 100,000 miles, but it's something that is with you at every moment with the data, with the software to ensure that you're safe, to ensure that you're being environmentally sensitive. And so it starts to look at the entire life cycle. I think the same is true with the university. When I went to school, I just took 36 classes. I filled out a bunch of blue books. All the data it's gone. The only thing that's left is my GPA. But going forward, when you have students, all of that data is trapped of how they manage their homework, how they executed on exams, how they actually think, the way their brain works. You can start to piece together what that human being is actually all about and start to track them through their career and give them guidance on the fields that they would work best in, so forth and so on. So I think that there would be enormous societal value. A final one, our healthcare system, it really is, let's call it what it is. It's a sick care system. You show up in a hospital with a malady and all of a sudden everybody's behind the 8 ball. And if you look at the payers, I think that they can play a fundamental role in transforming things because right now everybody hates them. They're just there to, you argue, should I get that MRI or not? But they're on the same table as all of us. They want us to be healthy. And if you can capture all of this data on us individually, you can start to get to a true wellness-based system that I think will have massive impact for society. So I think that digital in these cases is going to allow us to get to stakeholder capitalism as opposed to shareholder capitalism.
Well, I think the healthcare example is a particularly vivid one and relatively easy for me to understand. And because we do see that the ability to be more inclusive and affordable is so clearly there with digitized healthcare, although our system still is way behind in terms of making that transformation, but we can see where it would go. Now, your example of the university system is a more radical one in my thinking, but I know you work with a bunch of big universities. I mean, are some universities really starting to think about it the way you described?
Oh yeah, 100%. And they're now self-aware enough to say the system that we have is an industrial, meaning you put 20 kids in a room, give them the same lesson plan, and there's just a bell curve of how they perform. That system is actually not just inefficient, but in many cases cruel. And so several deans that we've worked with of university systems have said, look, don't index on like the Ivy League or Stanford or MIT because they say those kids are weird. They're hyperachievers. They're going to do well in any situation. The key societally is actually when you look at these state school systems that have a different social relationship, how can they provide 50,000 kids per year that are going to help that state or that community continue to thrive? And they said, each of them has said the same thing. The key is how do you get a kid from freshman year to sophomore year? And if you can get them to sophomore year with good grades, they're probably going to stick. But the real tragedy is often the reason they don't stick is because they're taking the wrong classes or the wrong major. And we've all seen this. Somebody who could be a brilliant with mathematics is taking some field completely differently, and they feel like an idiot. They say, hey, maybe college isn't for me. And they took those classes because one of their parents told them to do so, or their partner at the time was taking those classes. Who knows why? So if you could really get this pixelated view of somebody's personality and mind and match them with fields at a seminal age, they start to develop a real confidence about themselves, and you can change the trajectory of an entire, a person's life, a family, so forth and so on. So this is the thinking that's now coming into the educational system. And I think it could have enormous benefit.
Yeah, that's really exciting and not very well known. So maybe I want to pursue that further with you. Um, one of the things Bill McDonough was just talking about was this whole idea of starting business thinking with values and working from there rather than starting with the target for the year and working up from there. And I guess I'd love to go back to this question, which you answered definitively with a no, about what companies think about this and understand about it now. But the question of how likely are we going to see a shift? Because we are seeing, we started this conference with the Harris poll data that showed that Americans and people around the world are looking to business for the solutions of society's problems more and more because they're so dissatisfied with government's ability to do that in recent times. So if business is being asked to address society's problems, and if, as you hold, that a digital transformation of their business around data, a more responsive system will allow them to be more, building the pillars of a good society. Is it necessary that they have the values from the outset that that's what they want to do, or will they kind of just accidentally find their way into that? I mean, is this going to require companies to really think differently? And I'm sort of half answering my own question, but I want you to answer it also. Is the digital capability they're going to achieve going to help them understand they're capable of having the different values? Take any piece of that.
Yeah, just where you ended it, I think that's where truth is going to reside, is the ability to have these long-term impacts when you really understand how somebody is consuming your service or your product over time, and you can change outcomes. And there's a real responsibility that starts to come with that. So I think that's the key to all of this. But organizations are often very, very hard to change because it is about values, it is about culture, and that can become just like a human being or a sports team or a community. Those can get set in bedrock, and they're very, very hard to shift. This is really requires a true sense of leadership. Coming from, I'm quite optimistic, top down and bottom up, meaning I think boards are starting to really understand this as well as management teams. I think the young generation, Gen Y, coming into the workforce, and Gen X, they just naturally think this way. But there's the brass wall, it's from that police term of changing policing in New York in the 80s and 90s, that it was the folks with the brass on their shoulders were the toughest to change because they had no motivation to change. They'd been doing something that way for 20 years. They were close to retirement. They just weren't going to do it. And so I think those managers that have been so rewarded for a system over the last 20 years, how do you get them, the brass wall of the organization, to make this change? And it requires forceful leadership in many cases to do so, changing of incentives, hiring and promoting to really reinforce this. So I think this is a window of time that requires true leadership. Just a final thought on that, David, you see these shifts that happen where the economy and technology will move faster than governments can move. It happened 100 years ago with industrialization. That's what's happening right now. And it's why you're seeing, citing data that look like that. So this is a window where businesses, they know the answer. The question is, in many cases, are they willing to turn to their shareholders? And it may move them backwards for a quarter or two or a year or two to get the bigger prize on the other side. One thing that I think is fascinating, remember when Hummers were super hot, the Arnold Schwarzenegger days 15 years ago? And then you're, 10 years ago, 7 years ago, you're a social miscreant if you're driving a Hummer, and they disappeared. Now they're coming back. And it's actually pretty hot because it's an electric car. It's an electric truck. And so now you've got a machine that is responsible and fits a consumer need. But I think it took that in that case, General Motors, a long time to get through that cycle.
So you're saying the boards and the CEOs sort of see the mindset of the general public that is demanding, and the stakeholders generally, demanding that business take more responsibility, be more actively engaged in the problems of society. But it's the values, it's the managerial class that may not get it. I was struck today in the New York Times. There's an interview of Mark Benioff as the lead business story. David Streitfeld, the journalist who did the interview, is a friend of mine, and he's a very sardonic fellow. And it kind of comes through the article where he's kind of making fun of Benioff for relentlessly staying on message and talking about business job is to serve society. But there's an example of a leader who is not going to let this bone go. And, you know, he may totally fall flat on his face with the purchase of Slack, but he's not going to stop talking about business's role is to make society better. I assume you applaud that.
Oh, 100%. And by the way, I think he's going to do great with Slack, but when it, you know, Mark, I really admire him. He's always out in front of his headlights on these topics and has been for years. And it takes courage because sometimes you will be wrong, but the his heart's always in the right place. And the majority of the time he's going to be right. And so I think more people should really take his lead. So, you know, Mark's one of a kind, he's amazing, but I think that's a form of leadership that many could replicate.
Are there some other companies that you would call out that are doing a particularly good job of moving in the direction of being stakeholder-centric, and particularly, if possible, if there are examples of this, by being more digitally savvy?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're seeing it at risk of naming some names, but you know, one, for example, these are folks right under our nose that you may not associate with these, but like JP Morgan Chase has digitized, you know, remarkably well. And as a result, they're trying to democratize, you know, wealth management. It should not be the domain of, you know, the 1%, but, you know, how do you go to the mass affluent and, you know, right through all of society to educate people on how to manage their money and be much, much more effective in doing that. So, you know, that is something that, you know, doing good in society, most organizations, you know, it's good to cut a check to the American Red Cross, and when a hurricane shows up, people can scramble and help. That's fine. But the real value is in doing what you do every single day. And so, you know, you look at a JPMC, focusing on that through digital is a way that they can really help the community. You know, we're also seeing in this time of COVID, a lot of healthcare providers are really stepping up and doing amazing and very innovative things. We've seen it from Anthem Health, we've seen it from CVS Aetna, we've seen it from many that are you're really getting on the front foot, experimenting, moving very, very quickly to try to play a significant role during this time of crisis.
We had the CEO of NYU Langone at one of our events earlier this year, and they have this unbelievably data-centric approach. Basically, there's almost no procedure that's ever done in their system where there is not a number of metrics that are submitted into a vast database, and they can really determine the effectiveness and the success rate of every surgeon, every anesthesiologist, even the efficiency of a given operating room, et cetera, et cetera. And they had the best success at treating COVID patients of any hospital in New York.
Yep.
So it does begin to add up. Bill McDonough mentioned Microsoft. Do you think they're an example of a company that's done some pretty good stuff?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, what Satya's done overall, that's a case of really setting the tone, and it's tone from the top, and it's remarkable to see. That's one where I think they've been able to marry stakeholder capitalism and shareholder capitalism. And if you own Microsoft stock, you know, over his tenure, you've done very, very well. But at the same time, they've really done it right. And I think it creates pride of place. I mean, you know, hopefully we'll be done with COVID in the next several months and can get back on airplanes. But there's a confidence and pride of place when you go up to the Microsoft campus, and it's different and it's deeper. It's not about we've got these hot product sets or we're winning in the cloud with Azure, but you know, of course, you know, there is pride with that, but it's much deeper. It's values based, and so, you know, I think Microsoft is one. You know, Apple is another, where they are in that Benioff way. Now, again, different style, but you know, wading into those waters of how can we use our firm and our platform as a force for good, as opposed to, just pursuing selfish, going after selfish ends.
Well, we could go down the path of the contrary examples, but we know who they are. We're running out of time. We're pretty much out of time. Is there anything that I should have asked you that I didn't, or something that you were hoping to say that we didn't get to today?
No, this is a great conversation. The only thing, David, just to wrap up in 30 seconds, you touched on it with your Langone example. I spend a lot of time with management teams on their digital transformation, and we've got 300,000 associates at Cognizant doing that. And there's one question that I can ask leadership teams. I just ask them, what is your view on data, and what is data in the management process? And those that are obsessed with it are making good progress on digital, and those that aren't and just sort of treat it as a back office thing really aren't framing the issue the right way. So I think there's this data-centric empiricism where you can start to keep score, not just on how you run your business, but also in the progress that you're making around stakeholder capitalism.
I think this juxtaposition of digital centricity and stakeholder centricity is one that's going to be more and more fruitful going forward. And I hope you and I'll get a chance to talk about that more in the future. So Thank you, Malcolm. So great to have you.
Great. Thank you.
Really good conversation.